When did your brother's kindness finally run out? The last time I saw my brother Jake, he was standing in Marcus's driveway at 2 in the morning, screaming about how we'd all abandoned him. That was 3 months ago. Tonight, Marcus called me with news that would have broken his heart 5 years ago, but his voice was steady as granite when he said, "Jake's been arrested. Federal charges this time." I should have felt something stronger than the hollow relief that settled in my chest, but honestly, I was just tired. What did he do now? I asked, though part of me already knew. Jake had been running some kind of cryptocurrency scheme for the past 8 months, constantly posting about his revolutionary blockchain startup on social media while living in a studio apartment that Marcus had stopped paying for back in January. Wire fraud. Securities violations. The FBI raided his place this morning. Marcus paused, and I could hear him taking a sip of something. Probably coffee. He'd been pulling 18-hour days at his firm since Sarah left him. He built about 47 investors out of roughly $180,000. The number hit me like a physical weight. All those years of Marcus covering Jake's smaller disasters, the $3,000 he stole from Grandma Rose's jewelry box, the $8,500 in credit card debt, the $12,000 for his second stint in rehab after he relapsed and crashed Marcus's car into a fire hydrant. We'd all watched Marcus write check after check, make phone call after phone call, always believing that this time would be different. That this time, Jake would finally get his act together and become the little brother who used to build elaborate Lego cities with us and cry during Disney movies. Jesus, Marcus. How are you handling this? Another pause. I'm the one who turned him in. The words hung between us through the phone line. Outside my apartment window, Seattle's evening traffic hummed along like nothing had changed, like my family hadn't just officially imploded. You what? I gave the FBI everything. Bank records, screenshots of his investor calls, copies of the fake documents he was using. I'd been tracking his activities since February. Since right after Sarah broke off their engagement. Since Jake had systematically convinced Marcus's fiancée that Marcus was still enabling him financially, that he'd never change, that she'd be marrying into a family of dysfunction with no escape. Jake had been so convincing, so desperate to drag Marcus down to his level, that Sarah had believed every twisted half-truth. He destroyed my relationship out of pure spite, Marcus continued, his lawyer voice creeping in, controlled, factual, devastating. Called Sarah pretending to be concerned about my enabling behavior. Told her I was secretly funding his lifestyle, that I'd been lying to her about cutting him off. Even showed her fake bank statements he'd doctored to make it look like I was still sending him money. I remembered that awful night in March when Sarah had come to my apartment, sobbing and confused, asking if I knew about Marcus's secret payments to Jake. I tried to explain that Marcus had actually cut Jake off months earlier, but the damage was already done. Jake had planted enough seeds of doubt that Sarah couldn't trust anything Marcus said anymore. So when you found out about the crypto scheme, I decided he needed to face real consequences for once. Not from family. From the justice system. The brother I'd grown up with would never have made that call. The Marcus I knew would have mortgaged his soul before letting Jake face federal prison time. That Marcus had bailed Jake out of county lockup 4 times, had flown to Phoenix in 2019 to personally drive Jake home from a 3-day bender, had even hired Jake as a consultant at his law firm for 6 months just to give him steady income and health insurance. I need you to understand something, Emma, Marcus said, and I could hear him moving around his apartment, probably pacing, which he did when he was working through complex cases. I didn't just hand over evidence. I helped build the case. My coffee mug slipped in my grip. What do you mean? I used my connections in the U.S. Attorney's office. Called in favors. Made sure they had everything they needed for airtight charges. His voice carried that particular tone he got when he was explaining legal strategy to clients. Jake's been running this con for months, Emma. He had a fake LinkedIn profile claiming he went to Stanford. Photoshopped pictures of himself at blockchain conferences he never attended. He even created fake testimonials from supposed early investors. The systematic thoroughness of it made my stomach turn. This wasn't the impulsive, desperate Jake we were used to, the one who'd stolen Grandma's jewelry in a panic to cover gambling debts, or who'd forged checks when his rent was due. This was calculated. Predatory. How do you know all this? Because I've been watching him since December. Marcus's admission came out matter-of-factly, like he was discussing weather. I hired a private investigator after I found out he was using my name as a reference for potential investors. Telling people his lawyer brother was advising him on SEC compliance. The betrayal was so layered I could barely process it. Not just the lies, but Jake actively using Marcus's reputation, the reputation Marcus had spent 15 years building from nothing, to legitimize his fraud. Did he actually get any money using your name? 12 investors. $67,000 total. They all mentioned my supposed involvement when the FBI interviewed them. Marcus's voice cracked for the first time. One of them was a colleague's elderly father. He invested his late wife's life insurance payout because Jake convinced him it was a sure thing, backed by Seattle's most trusted securities lawyer. I felt sick. All those years of watching Marcus sacrifice for Jake, missing his own birthday dinner to bail Jake out of jail, postponing his honeymoon to check Jake into his second rehab, turning down a partnership track position in San Francisco because Jake needed family support, and this was how Jake repaid him. By weaponizing Marcus's love against strangers. The investigator started recording Jake's investor calls in January, Marcus continued. We needed evidence of intent to defraud, not just negligent misrepresentation. Jake delivered that in spades. He was explicitly promising guaranteed returns, claiming he had insider knowledge of pending cryptocurrency regulations, even telling people he had verbal commitments from major venture capital firms. All lies. Every word. The VC firms had never heard of him. The regulatory information he was citing didn't exist. The guaranteed returns were mathematically impossible given the actual blockchain technology he claimed to be developing. Marcus paused. Which also didn't exist, by the way. His entire revolutionary platform was a WordPress template he bought for $47. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. And somewhere in my grief for both my brothers, the one who'd become a predator and the one who'd turned into something harder than I recognized, a terrible question was forming. Marcus, I said carefully, what exactly did you tell the investigators about Jake's history? The silence stretched long enough that I knew the answer before he spoke. Everything, he said finally. The gambling addiction that started in college. The forged checks from mom and dad's account in 2018. The time he convinced Aunt Linda to co-sign a car loan and then defaulted, ruining her credit. The jewelry theft from Grandma Rose, all of it, Emma. I gave him a complete psychological profile. My heart started racing. Marcus, that's not just turning in evidence. That's character assassination. That's establishing a pattern of fraud and manipulation going back a decade. His lawyer voice was back, cold and clinical. The prosecution needed to demonstrate that this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. Jake's been running cons on family members since he was 22 years old. But some of that stuff was never prosecuted. The statute of limitations has expired, yes. But it's still relevant for sentencing guidelines and bail determination. I could hear papers rustling. Jake's not getting out of this one, Emma. His bail was set at $250,000 this morning. Cash only. The finality in his voice made my hands shake. You made sure he couldn't make bail. I made sure the judge understood exactly who Jake is. Someone who's been escalating fraudulent behavior for years, who has no permanent address, no legitimate employment history, and a demonstrated pattern of fleeing accountability. Marcus's breathing was steady, but I knew him well enough to hear the underlying tension. Someone who used his own brother's professional reputation to steal from a widower's life insurance money. Jesus Christ, Marcus. I set my coffee down before I dropped it. Do you understand what you've done? This isn't just cutting him off financially. You've destroyed any chance he had at. At what? Another con? Another victim? His voice rose for the first time, and I heard 15 years of suppressed anger finally breaking through. Emma, he looked that old man in the eye and promised him a secure retirement. Mr. Patterson is 73 years old. His wife died of cancer last year, and Jake convinced him to invest $15,000, everything left from her insurance policy, in a fake cryptocurrency that doesn't exist. The specific detail hit harder than all the abstract numbers we'd been throwing around. A real person, with a real loss, trusting Jake because Jake had invoked Marcus's name. I know it's awful, but nothing. Marcus's voice turned sharp, prosecutorial. I sat across from Mr. Patterson 2 weeks ago when he came to my office, asking if I really had endorsed Jake's investment platform. This 73-year-old widower was apologizing to me, Emma. Apologizing for bothering me about his lost life savings because Jake had told him I was too busy with high-profile clients to discuss small investments directly. The image made me physically ill. Oh God. He brought a folder with printed emails from Jake. Screenshots of fake LinkedIn profiles. A handwritten list of questions he'd prepared because he didn't want to waste my time. Marcus's voice cracked again. He'd been eating one meal a day since February, trying to stretch his social security because he thought his wife's insurance money was tied up in Jake's pending platform launch. I pressed my palm against my forehead, trying to process the calculated cruelty of it. Using someone's grief, their trust, their hope for financial security, it was beyond anything Jake had done to our family. We knew him, understood his patterns, chose to enable or endure his behavior. But strangers? The investigator found 16 other elderly investors, Marcus continued. Jake specifically targeted people over 65, mostly widows and widowers. He'd find obituaries in local papers, cross-reference them with social media profiles, then reach out claiming he'd met their spouse at some community event. Said he wanted to help them honor their partner's memory by securing their financial future. That's sick. That's federal prison. The satisfaction in his voice scared me more than Jake's crimes. This wasn't the Marcus who used to sneak Jake extra birthday presents when money was tight, or who'd stayed up all night researching treatment options after Jake's first arrest. This was someone harder, someone who'd learned to weaponize his own competence. How long? I asked quietly. Minimum 7 years. Probably 12 with the sentencing enhancements. Marcus paused. I made sure the prosecutor understood the sophistication level of the fraud. The targeting of vulnerable populations. The abuse of familial reputation. You made sure, I repeated. Marcus, do you even hear yourself? You sound like you're proud of this. The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Proud? Marcus's voice went dangerously quiet. Emma, I want you to listen to me very carefully. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from Detective Morrison, you remember him, from when Jake got arrested for the check fraud? He told me they'd found something in Jake's apartment during a wellness check. My stomach dropped. What kind of something? A list. Handwritten, in Jake's messy scrawl. 23 names with dollar amounts next to them. I could hear Marcus opening what sounded like a file folder. Our names were on it, Emma. Yours and mine. Along with Mom and Dad's life insurance beneficiary information, Grandma Rose's estimated home value, and Aunt Linda's 401k balance. The words hit me like ice water. What are you saying? I'm saying Jake had researched the net worth of every family member. He had our social security numbers, bank routing information, employment details. The detective thinks he was planning to use us as collateral for a much bigger fraud scheme. Marcus's breathing was controlled, but I could hear the suppressed fury. Your apartment lease was in there, Emma. The name of your manager at the museum. Even your direct deposit information. My hands went numb. How could he possibly have? Remember Christmas dinner at Mom and Dad's? When you left your purse in the living room and Jake offered to grab it when we were leaving? Marcus's voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. He photographed your driver's license, your credit cards, probably your checkbook. The detective found copies of family documents going back months. The memory came flooding back, Jake being unusually helpful that night, insisting on carrying bags to cars, offering to grab forgotten items. I thought he was finally making an effort to be less selfish. There's more, Marcus continued. He had a timeline. Notes about Dad's retirement date, when Mom would start collecting Social Security, speculation about when Grandma Rose might need to sell her house for assisted living. Paper rustled again. He wrote E's museum job equals steady credit score, good for co-signing next to your name. I felt like I was going to throw up. He was planning to use me as a reference for investors? Worse. He was planning to forge loan applications with you as co-signer. The detective found draft paperwork for a $75,000 business loan with your information already filled in. Marcus's voice went deadly calm. Jake had practiced your signature, Emma. There were 3 pages of him copying your name from different documents. The betrayal was so complete, so calculating, that I couldn't find words. This wasn't the desperate, impulsive brother we'd grown up with. This was someone who'd spent months cataloging his own family members like assets to be harvested. When did you find out about all this? 2 weeks before I contacted the FBI. Marcus paused. The same day I realized Jake had also been in contact with Sarah's elderly mother in Portland. He'd somehow gotten her phone number and was asking about her late husband's pension benefits. The final piece clicked into place. That's why Sarah really broke up with you. Jake convinced her mother that I was involved in his investment consulting business. Mrs. Chen started asking Sarah if she was comfortable marrying into a family with complicated financial arrangements. Marcus's voice turned bitter. Sarah thought I'd been hiding criminal associations from her. That I was using my law practice to help Jake launder money. But you could have explained. How? By showing her police reports of Jake's previous arrests? By admitting I'd been covering up his crimes for years? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Jake made sure Sarah would never trust my explanations. He'd already poisoned the well by telling her mother that I had a history of lying about family finances to protect him. I slumped against my kitchen counter, overwhelmed by the systematic destruction Jake had orchestrated. Not just theft or fraud, but the deliberate sabotage of Marcus's entire life. So when you turned him in, I made sure he'd never be in a position to destroy anyone else's family. The weight of Marcus's words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I understood his logic, even admired the surgical precision with which he dismantled Jake's operation. But something cold was growing in my chest as I processed what my older brother had become. Marcus, I said carefully, what happens to us now? To our family? What family? His response came too quickly, too rehearsed. Jake made his choice when he decided to treat us like marks in a con game. Mom and Dad will understand once they see the evidence. But I knew our parents better than that. They'd already been struggling with Marcus's decision to cut Jake off financially. Mom still called me every few weeks, asking if I'd heard from Jake, wondering if we were being too hard on him. The idea that their youngest son was now facing federal prison time would destroy them. Have you told them yet? I'm driving down to Spokane tomorrow morning. Marcus's voice softened slightly. I have copies of everything. The investor testimonials, the forged documents, the list he made of our personal information. They need to understand this isn't the Jake who stole $20 from Dad's wallet in high school. What about Grandma Rose? The silence stretched long enough that I knew this was the conversation Marcus had been dreading most. She's 87, Emma. The stress of a federal trial, the media attention when this goes public. He trailed off. Dr. Martinez said her blood pressure spikes had been getting worse since Jake stopped visiting. Jake had been Grandma Rose's favorite since we were children. Even after he'd stolen her jewelry, she'd forgiven him within months, claiming he was just lost and needed extra love to find his way back. She'd been asking about him constantly since Marcus cut off contact, convinced something terrible had happened because her sweet Jakey would never just disappear. She's going to blame us, I said quietly. She's going to blame me, Marcus corrected. And she'll be right too. For the first time since this conversation started, I heard something besides cold determination in my brother's voice. Doubt, maybe. Or the first crack in his certainty that he'd made the right choice. Marcus, is there any part of you that thinks? I struggled to find the right words. What if this breaks him completely? What if 12 years in federal prison turns him into someone even worse? Then at least he'll be someone else's problem. The harshness of it made me flinch. Jesus Christ, you don't mean that. Don't I? Marcus's voice sharpened again. Emma, I need you to understand something. While I was building the case against Jake, I learned things about his activities that weren't in the initial FBI report. Things I haven't told you. My stomach clenched. What kind of things? The private investigator found evidence that Jake's been running smaller cons for the past 3 years. Not just the cryptocurrency scheme. I heard papers shuffling again. Remember when Cousin Beth's identity got stolen in 2021? When someone opened credit cards in her name and maxed them out before she caught it? That was Jake? That was Jake. He'd gotten her social security number at Uncle Mike's funeral when she was handling the memorial service arrangements. Marcus's voice took on that prosecutorial tone again. The investigator tracked the credit card purchases. Electronics that Jake then sold on Facebook Marketplace. Always for exactly enough cash to cover his rent or car payments. The betrayal felt endless, each revelation worse than the last. Who else? Sarah's cousin in Vancouver. Jake met him once at a barbecue, got his information, and used his identity to open a business checking account that he used for money laundering. Marcus paused. There's also evidence he was stealing mail from our parents' neighbors. Social security checks, insurance payments. The postal inspector thinks he'd been doing it for months. I pressed my free hand against my eyes, trying to block out the image of Jake lurking around Mom and Dad's neighborhood, systematically victimizing their elderly neighbors. How many people? At least 47 that we can prove. Probably more. Marcus's voice carried a weight of exhausted disgust. The FBI thinks he's been running identity theft schemes since 2019. Small-scale stuff, mostly targeting elderly people who wouldn't notice missing mail or unusual account activity right away. And you made sure they knew about all of it. I made sure they had everything they needed to put him away long enough that he can't hurt anyone else. The protective instinct I'd felt for Jake my entire life was warring with a growing horror at who he'd actually become. This wasn't addiction or mental illness or desperate circumstances. This was predatory behavior, systematic and calculating. Marcus, I said slowly, what if Mom and Dad don't understand? What if they think we should have tried to help him instead of destroying him? Another long pause. Then I'll have lost everyone, he said finally. But at least Mr. Patterson will get his wife's insurance money back. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. I couldn't stop thinking about that list Jake had made, 23 family members cataloged like inventory. By 10 a.m., I was sitting in my car outside Grandma Rose's assisted living facility, trying to work up the courage to go inside. She deserved to hear about Jake's arrest from family, not from some reporter or neighbor who'd seen it on the news. But every time I imagined her face when I explained that her sweet Jakey was in federal custody, my resolve crumbled. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Mom and Dad took it better than expected. Dad said he suspected something was wrong when Jake started asking detailed questions about their retirement accounts last Christmas. Heading to see Grandma Rose at 2 p.m. You don't have to be there. But I did have to be there. For 15 years, I'd been the bridge between my brothers, translating Marcus's protective anger for Jake, explaining Jake's chaos to Marcus, always believing I could somehow hold our family together through sheer force of will. Now that bridge was burning, and I needed to see it through to the end. I found Grandma Rose in the sunroom, working on a crossword puzzle and humming softly to herself. At 87, she was still sharp as a tack, though her arthritis had gotten worse since her fall last winter. She lit up when she saw me. Emma, sweetheart. What a lovely surprise. She patted the chair next to her. I was just thinking about you yesterday. Mrs. Henderson down the hall was telling me about her granddaughter who works at a museum in Chicago. Reminded me of my smart girl. I sat down, my throat already tight. Grandma, I need to talk to you about something important. About Jake. Her expression shifted immediately, worry creeping into her faded blue eyes. Oh no. Has something happened to him? I knew it, he hasn't called in over a month, and that's not like my Jakey. He's been arrested, Grandma. Federal charges. The crossword puzzle book slipped from her hands. Arrested? But what for? Surely there's been some mistake. I'd rehearsed this conversation during the drive over, but sitting here looking at her hopeful face, all my careful explanations evaporated. He was running a fraud scheme. Stealing money from investors, mostly elderly people. That can't be right. Her voice was firm, almost scolding. Jake wouldn't steal from old folks. He knows how hard it is for people on fixed incomes, he's always been so thoughtful about that. The irony was devastating. Jake had been thoughtful about elderly people's financial vulnerabilities, thoughtful enough to exploit them systematically. Grandma, there's more. The police found evidence that he's been stealing people's identities for years. I took a shaky breath. He had a list with all our personal information on it. Bank accounts, social security numbers. He was planning to use our names for more fraud. She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift in her expression. Not acceptance, exactly, but a flicker of recognition. The questions, she said slowly. Last time he visited, must have been January, he asked me so many questions about my accounts. Said he was worried about scammers targeting seniors, wanted to make sure I was being careful. Her voice grew smaller. He wrote down my bank's name, said he wanted to research their security features for me. My heart sank. Even here, even with the person who loved him most unconditionally, Jake had been working an angle. He also asked about my jewelry box, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Said he felt terrible about what happened before, wanted to know if I'd been able to replace any of the pieces he'd taken. Asked specifically about my wedding ring, whether I kept it in the same place. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Marcus will be here soon, I said gently. He has more details about what Jake was doing. I wanted you to hear about the arrest from us first. Grandma Rose was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the facility's garden. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but infinitely sad. I keep thinking about the little boy who used to help me bake cookies every Sunday. He'd stand on that step stool in my kitchen, so serious about measuring everything perfectly. She turned to look at me. When did I lose him, Emma? When did my Jakey become someone who would hurt people like me? I didn't have an answer for her. When Marcus arrived at 2 p.m., he looked like he'd aged 5 years since yesterday. His usually perfect lawyer appearance was disheveled, wrinkled shirt, coffee stain on his tie, stubble that suggested he hadn't slept. But his jaw was set with the same grim determination I'd heard in his voice. Grandma Rose had spent the intervening 2 hours asking me the same questions over and over. Are you sure they have the right person? Could someone have stolen Jake's identity? Maybe he was trying to help those people and got confused about the paperwork? Each repetition broke my heart a little more. Hello, Grandma, Marcus said, kissing her forehead before settling into the chair across from us. He brought a manila folder, thick with documents. I know Emma told you about Jake's arrest. I wanted to show you some things so you'd understand this isn't a misunderstanding. Marcus, sweetheart, surely you can fix this? Her voice carried that particular hope that elderly people get when they believe their successful grandchild can solve anything. You're such a good lawyer. Can't you represent him? I can't represent him because I'm the one who provided evidence for his prosecution. Marcus's words landed like stones in still water. I turned him in, Grandma. She went very still. You what? Jake used my name and reputation to steal money from people. People your age, living on social security and pension checks. Marcus opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. This is Mr. Patterson. He's 73. Jake convinced him to invest his late wife's life insurance money in a fake cryptocurrency scheme by claiming I had personally endorsed it. Grandma Rose studied the photo, a kind-faced man with white hair and thick glasses, smiling at whoever was taking the picture. He looks like your grandfather, she said quietly. Jake stole $15,000 from him. Mr. Patterson has been rationing his heart medication because he couldn't afford to refill his prescription after Jake took his money. I watched my grandmother's face crumple, and I wanted to tell Marcus to stop, that she'd heard enough. But he continued with surgical precision. There's also Mrs. Chen in Portland, she invested $12,000 of her retirement savings. And Mrs. Rodriguez in Tacoma, who gave Jake $8,000 she'd been saving for her great-granddaughter's college fund. Marcus pulled out more photographs. 17 elderly victims total. Jake specifically targeted people who had recently lost spouses because grief makes people more trusting. Stop, Grandma Rose whispered, but Marcus wasn't finished. He had your information too, Grandma. Your bank account numbers, your social security details, the estimated value of your house. Marcus's voice softened slightly. We found evidence he was planning to forge loan applications using your name as collateral. The silence in the sunroom was deafening. Outside the window, I could see other residents tending the garden, living their quiet lives, probably trusting that their own grandchildren would never see them as opportunities to exploit. How long have you known? Grandma Rose asked finally. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I've suspected he was running new schemes since December. I had proof by February. February. She nodded slowly. And you waited until now to tell me. I wanted to be sure. I needed enough evidence to. You needed enough evidence to destroy him completely. Her voice wasn't accusatory, just tired. Marcus, do you remember when you were 8 and Jake was 4, and you boys broke my china cabinet playing baseball in the house? Marcus blinked, clearly thrown by the change in direction. Yes. You spent the entire afternoon gluing the pieces back together before I got home from grocery shopping. Tiny fragments, some no bigger than my fingernail. Your father found you in the living room at dinner time, covered in ceramic dust, still trying to make it perfect again. She looked at him with infinite sadness. You've always been a fixer, sweetheart. Always believed you could put the broken things back together if you just worked hard enough. This isn't the same thing, Grandma. Isn't it? She gestured to the photograph spread across her lap. You spent 15 years trying to glue Jake back together, and when you finally realized it was impossible, you decided to smash him into pieces too small to ever reassemble. Marcus's composure finally cracked. He was going to use your information to steal from more people. I had to stop him. By becoming someone I don't recognize? Grandma Rose gathered the photographs and handed them back to him. The Marcus I raised would have found another way. The Marcus I know would have warned these people, helped them get their money back, gotten Jake the help he needed. He wouldn't have methodically built a case designed to put his own brother in prison for over a decade. Jake chose his path. And you chose yours. She struggled to her feet, suddenly looking every one of her 87 years. I need to rest now. This is too much for an old woman to process. Marcus stood quickly. Grandma, please. I know this is hard to understand, but Jake is dangerous. He's not the little boy from your kitchen anymore. She paused at the door, one hand on her walker. Neither are you, sweetheart. Neither are you. After she left, Marcus and I sat in the sunroom surrounded by the detritus of our demolished family. The photographs of Jake's victims were scattered across the coffee table like evidence in a courtroom. Outside, Mrs. Henderson was showing another resident her tomato plants, their voices carrying through the open window in cheerful normalcy. She's wrong, Marcus said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Is she? He looked at me sharply. You think I should have let him keep stealing from elderly people? Let him forge loan documents with your name? I think maybe there was something between let him do whatever he wants and systematically destroy his entire life. I picked up one of the photographs, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. These people deserved protection, Marcus. But Jake deserved help. I tried help for 15 years. No, you tried control. You tried management. You tried throwing money at problems and hoping they'd disappear. I turned to face him fully. When's the last time you actually talked to Jake about getting real psychological treatment? Not rehab for addiction, but actual therapy for whatever's been driving him to do this? Marcus was quiet for a long time. You can't therapy someone out of being a sociopath, Emma. Is that your professional diagnosis? Or is that just easier than admitting you gave up on him? The question hung between us like a challenge. I watched my older brother, the one who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd scared away bullies at school, who'd paid for my college textbooks when mom and dad's finances were tight, struggle with the possibility that his surgical precision might have been motivated by something uglier than justice. The sentencing hearing is in 6 weeks, he said finally. Jake's public defender is going to argue for minimum security, early parole consideration. They'll want family character witnesses. And I'm going to testify for the prosecution about his pattern of escalating fraud. Marcus met my eyes. I'm going to make sure he gets the maximum sentence. That's when I realized my brother Marcus, the real one, the one who used to cry at Disney movies and spend his allowance on birthday presents for Jake, might be just as lost as Jake was. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, which felt absurdly mundane for something that would determine whether our family had any chance of surviving this intact. Marcus had been preparing his testimony for weeks, treating it like any other case, complete with color-coded binders and practice sessions in front of his bathroom mirror. I knew because Mom told me. She'd driven up from Spokane the weekend before, ostensibly to support Marcus through this difficult time, but really to make one last desperate attempt at talking him out of testifying against Jake. Emma, you have to help me understand, she said, sitting at my kitchen table with untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. How did we get to a place where one of my sons is sending the other to federal prison? I'd been dreading this conversation for weeks. Mom had taken Jake's arrest harder than I'd expected, not because she didn't believe he was guilty, but because she couldn't comprehend the level of calculation involved. Dad had been stoic, almost relieved, like he'd been waiting for this other shoe to drop for years. But Mom kept asking questions that had no good answers. Marcus thinks he's protecting people, I said carefully. Marcus thinks he's God, she replied, and I was startled by the sharpness in her voice. Did you know he's been in contact with the victims' families? Not just for the investigation, he's been coordinating with them about their impact statements. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean he's coaching them on how to present their testimony for maximum emotional effect. Mrs. Rodriguez called me yesterday, Emma. She wanted to thank me for raising such a compassionate young man who was helping her grandson understand why Grandma's college fund was gone. Mom's hand shook slightly as she picked up her coffee cup. She had no idea I was Jake's mother. The image of Marcus strategically orchestrating the victim testimony made me feel sick. It was one thing to provide evidence, it was another to actively shape the narrative for maximum punishment. She told me Marcus had helped her draft a letter to the judge about how Jake's theft had affected her family's Christmas plans, their vacation savings, her granddaughter's trust in adults. Mom set her cup down hard enough that coffee sloshed onto my table. He's not just seeking justice, Emma. He's seeking vengeance. I thought about Marcus's voice when he described Jake's crimes, the cold satisfaction, the legal precision, the complete absence of grief for the brother he was destroying. Have you talked to him about this? I tried. He told me I was being emotionally compromised and couldn't see the situation clearly. Mom laughed, but there was no humor in it. My youngest son is facing 12 years in federal prison, and my oldest son thinks I'm too emotional about it. What does Dad think? Your father thinks Marcus is doing what needs to be done, and that I should stop enabling Jake's behavior by feeling sad about it. She pressed her hands against her eyes. 29 years of marriage, and I'm discovering my husband has apparently been waiting for an excuse to write off our son permanently. The fractures in our family were spreading faster than I could track them. Jake's crimes had provided the catalyst, but the underlying breaks had been there for years. Marcus's resentment at always being the responsible one, Dad's exhaustion with Jake's chaos, Mom's guilt over where they'd gone wrong, my own desperate need to believe we could all still love each other despite everything. Mom, what if Marcus is right? What if Jake really is too dangerous to give another chance? She was quiet for a long time, staring out my window at the Seattle skyline. Then we'll visit him in prison, she said finally. But we don't abandon him, Emma. We don't let our other son systematically destroy what's left of his life out of spite. It's not spite. Isn't it? Mom turned to face me fully. Marcus lost his fiancée, Emma. The love of his life walked away because of Jake's lies, and now Marcus wants Jake to lose everything too. That's not justice. That's revenge. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. All of Marcus's talk about protecting victims and establishing patterns, how much of that was genuine concern, and how much was a lawyer's skill at rationalizing personal vengeance? What do you want me to do? I want you to go to that hearing next Tuesday and remind the judge that Jake is still someone's son. Someone's brother. Someone who used to build Lego cities and cry during Disney movies. Mom's voice broke slightly. Because Marcus isn't going to do it. And if nobody speaks for the Jake we used to know, then we really will lose him forever. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Speaking at Jake's sentencing hearing would mean publicly opposing Marcus, choosing sides in a war that neither of my brothers could win. It would mean standing up in federal court and asking for mercy for someone who had systematically preyed on elderly people, including our own grandmother. But it would also mean refusing to let Marcus's perfectly constructed case be the final word on who Jake was as a human being. I don't know if I can do that to Marcus, I admitted. Then you're choosing between your brothers, Mom said quietly. And that choice will define who you are for the rest of your life. After she left, I sat in my kitchen for hours, thinking about choices and consequences and the terrible mathematics of family loyalty. Outside, Seattle continued its normal rhythm, completely indifferent to the fact that everything I believed about love and forgiveness and second chances was crumbling around me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Emma, this is Jake. I get one call tomorrow. Can you be there? The number haunted me all night. Jake had somehow gotten access to a phone, probably through another inmate or a sympathetic guard, and was reaching out after 3 months of silence. Part of me wanted to delete the message and pretend I'd never seen it. But by morning, I knew I had to take the call. He rang at exactly 2 p.m., and his voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Emma? Thank God you picked up. There was background noise, other conversations, the echo of institutional walls. I only have 15 minutes. Jake. I didn't know what else to say. 3 months of anger and grief and confusion compressed into his name. I know you probably hate me. I know what Marcus told everyone about the list, about the investors. His voice cracked. But I need you to know I never would have used your information. The stuff about co-signing loans, that was it was like a fantasy. I write things down when I'm desperate, but I never actually. Jake, stop. I couldn't listen to another manipulation, another carefully crafted explanation designed to minimize his choices. I've seen the evidence. I've met Mr. Patterson. The silence stretched long enough that I thought we'd been disconnected. Then, you met him? Marcus introduced us. 73 years old, rationing his heart medication because you stole his wife's life insurance money. My voice was steadier than I felt. He brought a folder to Marcus's office, Jake. Handwritten notes because he didn't want to waste time asking about his investment. Jesus Christ. Jake's breathing was shaky. Emma, I never met most of those people face to face. It was all phone calls and emails. I didn't think about. I mean, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't think about them as real people with real problems. That's not better, Jake. That's worse. I know. His voice was barely audible. I know it's worse. I've been sitting in here for 3 months thinking about Mrs. Chen's voice when she called asking about her guaranteed returns. She sounded just like Grandma Rose. The comparison made my throat tight. Then why did you keep calling her? Why did you take $12,000 from someone who sounded like our grandmother? Because I'm sick, Emma. Because something in my brain is broken and I don't know how to fix it. Jake's words came out in a rush. Patterson would ask about my family, said I reminded him of his nephew in Chicago. The pathetic desperation in his voice made me feel sick. These elderly victims had become Jake's fantasy family, people who believed he was successful, trustworthy, worth their investment. That makes it worse, not better. I know. God, Emma, I know. Jake was crying now, ugly sobs that echoed off concrete walls. But I need you to understand something about Marcus. About what he's planning to do at the sentencing. My stomach clenched. What about it? My lawyer found out Marcus has been working with the prosecutor's office since April. Not just providing evidence, he's been consulting on sentencing strategy. Jake's voice turned urgent. He helped them structure the charges to carry mandatory minimums. He's the reason I couldn't make bail. Jake. Emma, he's not just testifying about my crimes. He's testifying about things that were never prosecuted. The check fraud from 2018, the credit card thing with Cousin Beth, even stuff from when we were teenagers. Jake's breathing was getting faster. My lawyer says Marcus provided psychological evaluations, family history, details about our childhood that make me look like a career criminal. The scope of Marcus's involvement was worse than I'd imagined. What kind of childhood details? Remember when I was 16 and got caught selling fake IDs at school? Marcus told them about that. And the time I forged Dad's signature on a permission slip in 8th grade. Even the lie I told Aunt Linda about needing money for textbooks when I really wanted video games. Jake's voice cracked. 20 years of stupid teenage mistakes, presented as evidence of lifelong criminal intent. I pressed my palm against my forehead, trying to process the calculated thoroughness of Marcus's betrayal. Jake, some of that stuff might be relevant for sentencing. Is it relevant that I used to steal quarters from his piggy bank when we were kids? Because that's in there too. Jake laughed bitterly. Marcus gave them a 40-page family history that makes me sound like a sociopath from birth. You're not a sociopath. The words came out automatically, muscle memory from 15 years of defending him. Aren't I? Jake's question hung in the air like a challenge. Emma, I spent 6 months calling elderly widows and making them believe their dead husbands would be proud of their smart investment decisions. I used their grief to steal their money. What would you call that? I didn't have an answer. The sentencing is next Tuesday, Jake continued. My lawyer thinks I'm looking at the maximum, 12 years, minimum security denied because of the sophisticated nature of the fraud and my extensive criminal history. All thanks to my loving brother's testimony. Jake, what do you want me to do? What's the point of this call? I want you to be there. In the courtroom. His voice grew quiet. Not to defend me, I know I deserve prison. But to remind everyone that I used to be someone you could love. Before Marcus finishes erasing that person completely. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone and realizing that Tuesday's hearing wasn't just about Jake's sentencing. It was about whether Marcus's version of our family history, the one where Jake was irredeemably broken from childhood, would become the official record of who we'd always been. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Seattle weather that makes everything feel like a funeral. I stood outside the federal courthouse at 8:30 a.m., watching lawyers and defendants and families stream through security, all of us carrying our separate tragedies into the marble-columned building where justice gets parsed out in 15-minute increments. I hadn't told Marcus I was coming. In the week since Jake's phone call, I drafted and deleted dozens of texts to my older brother, explanations, pleas, accusations that I could never quite find the right words for. How do you tell someone that their pursuit of justice has started to look like systematic cruelty? How do you ask your brother to show mercy to the person who destroyed his entire future? Instead, I'd spent the weekend reading everything I could about federal sentencing guidelines, victim impact statements, and the psychology of white-collar crime. I'd learned that Jake was facing 87 to 108 months under the federal guidelines, but that departures from those ranges were possible based on exceptional circumstances, either aggravating factors that could increase his sentence, or mitigating factors that might reduce it. Marcus, I realized, had been working to eliminate every possible mitigating factor while amplifying every aggravating one. I found a seat in the back of courtroom 4B, close enough to see everything but far enough away that Marcus wouldn't notice me immediately. The federal courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, all dark wood and burgundy carpet, with an American flag drooping beside the judge's bench like it was tired of witnessing humanity's failures. Jake was led in first, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow and thin. 3 months in King County Jail had aged him, his hair was longer and unkempt, his shoulders hunched in a way that suggested he'd learned to make himself smaller. When he turned to scan the gallery, his eyes found mine immediately, and I watched relief and shame war across his face in equal measure. Marcus entered 5 minutes later with the prosecution team, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing his most expensive suit, the one he bought for his wedding to Sarah. He looked every inch the successful federal prosecutor, confident and prepared, until he spotted me in the gallery. Our eyes met for exactly 3 seconds, and I watched something flicker across his face that might have been guilt or might have been anger. He didn't acknowledge me beyond that glance. Judge Patricia Hendricks took the bench at exactly 9 a.m., a small woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense expression that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of human weakness. She moved through the preliminary proceedings with efficient precision, confirming Jake's identity, reviewing the charges, establishing that he understood the consequences of his guilty plea. Mr. Morrison, she said, addressing Jake directly, you pleaded guilty to 19 counts of wire fraud and 3 counts of securities violations. Do you understand that you're facing a potential sentence of 87 to 108 months in federal prison? Yes, Your Honor, Jake replied, his voice barely audible even with the courtroom's amplification system. We'll hear from the government first regarding their sentencing recommendation. Mr. Stevens? Assistant U.S. Attorney David Stevens stood up, a thin man in his 40s with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from never losing cases. Thank you, Your Honor. The government recommends a sentence of 108 months, the maximum under the guidelines, based on several aggravating factors. He launched into a methodical recitation of Jake's crimes, but with details I hadn't heard before. The sophistication of the fake cryptocurrency platform. The psychological manipulation tactics Jake had used to target recently widowed victims. The systematic way he'd researched potential marks through obituaries and social media. The defendant didn't simply commit fraud, Your Honor. He weaponized grief, Stevens continued. Mrs. Rodriguez testified that Mr. Morrison spent 47 minutes on the phone with her, asking detailed questions about her late husband's hobbies and interests, so he could reference them in future calls to build trust. My stomach turned as Stevens painted Jake as a calculating predator who had studied his victims like a serial killer studies potential targets. Some of it was undoubtedly true, but the portrait being presented was so completely devoid of humanity that Jake might as well have been a corporation being sentenced for environmental violations. The government also calls attention to the defendant's extensive history of fraud and deception dating back over a decade, Stevens said, and I knew we were about to hear Marcus's version of our family story. We have testimony from his older brother, Marcus Morrison, regarding a pattern of escalating criminal behavior that demonstrates the defendant's fundamental disregard for others' welfare. Marcus stood up, walked to the witness stand, and was sworn in with the same professional composure he brought to every legal proceeding. But sitting in the gallery, watching him prepare to systematically destroy what was left of Jake's life, I finally understood what Grandma Rose had meant when she said she didn't recognize him anymore. Mr. Morrison, Stevens began, can you describe your relationship to the defendant? Jake is my younger brother, Marcus replied, his voice steady and clinical. I'm also an attorney specializing in securities law, so I'm particularly familiar with the type of fraud he committed. Can you tell the court about the defendant's history of deceptive behavior? Marcus opened a manila folder, the same one he'd brought to Grandma Rose's facility, and began reading from what sounded like a prepared statement. Jake has been committing fraud against family members and others for over a decade. In 2019, he forged checks from our parents' joint checking account totaling $3,400. As Marcus methodically documented every lie, every theft, every manipulation from the past 15 years, I watched Jake's shoulders curve further inward. This wasn't testimony about his crimes, this was character assassination, presented with the precision of someone who had spent months preparing to destroy his own brother as efficiently as possible. But what horrified me more than Marcus's words was his tone. Calm. Professional. Completely detached, like he was describing the criminal history of a stranger rather than the little brother who used to crawl into his bed during thunderstorms. The defendant has shown a consistent pattern of escalating manipulation, Marcus continued, his voice never wavering from that clinical prosecutor tone. In 2020, he convinced our elderly grandmother to change her will, claiming he was starting a business that would honor the family legacy. She signed over power of attorney before we discovered the business didn't exist. My blood went cold. Jake had never mentioned anything about Grandma Rose's will, and from the way Jake's head snapped up at the witness table, this was news to him too. I watched my younger brother's face crumple as he realized Marcus was either lying or had discovered something Jake thought was still secret. Did your grandmother suffer financial losses as a result? Stevens asked. She nearly lost her house, Marcus replied matter-of-factly. Jake had begun the process of taking out a reverse mortgage against her property when my father discovered the paperwork. We were able to stop it, but only because Dad happened to check her mail that week. Judge Hendricks looked up sharply from her notes. Mr. Morrison, are you saying the defendant attempted to steal his grandmother's home? Not steal, Your Honor. Liquidate. Jake had convinced her that selling the house and moving in with our parents would be better for everyone while he used the proceeds for his business investment. Marcus's voice carried just the right amount of controlled disgust. Our grandmother is 87 and has lived in that house for 60 years. The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of Jake crying, quiet, broken sobs that echoed off the marble walls. I wanted to stand up and scream that Marcus was manipulating the narrative, that Grandma Rose had never been in danger of losing her house, that this was about revenge, not justice. But I sat frozen as my older brother systematically destroyed any possibility of mercy for Jake. Mr. Morrison, in your professional opinion, what would you recommend for sentencing? Stevens asked. Marcus looked directly at Jake for the first time since taking the stand. Maximum security prison, full term, no early release consideration. My brother is a career criminal who has spent 15 years perfecting his ability to manipulate vulnerable people. The only thing that will stop him from creating more victims is permanent removal from society. The finality of those words hit me like a physical blow. Not rehabilitation. Not treatment. Permanent removal from society, like Jake was a rabid animal that needed to be put down. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. No further questions. Jake's public defender, a tired-looking woman named Janet Walsh who probably had 50 other cases this month, stood up for cross-examination. Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you've had a contentious relationship with your brother for many years? I've had a protective relationship with my family for many years, Marcus replied smoothly. Protective enough to hire a private investigator to spy on the defendant for 8 months. Protective enough to document his crimes when it became clear he was targeting elderly victims. And did this documentation begin before or after your fiancé broke up with you due to issues related to your brother? Marcus's composed mask slept for just a second. That's irrelevant too. Your Honor, it goes to bias, Walsh interrupted. The witness has a personal vendetta against my client that predates this criminal investigation. Judge Hendricks leaned forward. I'll allow the question. Mr. Morrison, when did your fiancé end your engagement? February 14th. Marcus's voice turned tight. But that doesn't change the facts of Jake's crimes. Did you begin building this case before or after February 14th? The silence stretched long enough that everyone in the courtroom understood the answer before Marcus spoke. After. No further questions. As Marcus returned to his seat, he looked older somehow, like Janet Walsh had managed to crack something fundamental in his perfectly constructed case. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I saw a flicker of the brother I'd grown up with, vulnerable, hurt, human. But then Stevens called his next witness. The government calls Mrs. Elena Rodriguez. A small Hispanic woman in her 70s walked slowly to the witness stand, and I realized Marcus wasn't finished destroying Jake. He was just getting started. Mrs. Rodriguez's testimony was devastating in its quiet dignity. She spoke in accented English about her late husband's dreams for their granddaughter's education, about the $8,000 she'd saved over 3 years by skipping meals and walking instead of taking the bus. When she described Jake's phone calls, how he'd remembered her husband's favorite baseball team, how he'd promised that her investment would honor Miguel's memory, several jurors wiped their eyes. But what broke me wasn't her pain. It was watching Jake's face as she spoke. He wasn't crying anymore, he was listening with the kind of focused attention I remembered from when we were kids, and he was trying to memorize something important. Like he was finally, truly understanding what he'd done to real people. Mr. Morrison told me his platform was called Legacy Coin, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. He said it was perfect for people like me who wanted to build something lasting for our families. He even sent me pictures of the office where he worked, with all the computers and the smart-looking young people. Stevens nodded sympathetically. And did you ever see Mr. Morrison in person, Mrs. Rodriguez? No, sir. But he called me every Friday for 2 months. Always asked about my granddaughter Sophia, about her grades and her college applications. Said he was so proud to help a family that valued education. She looked directly at Jake. I trusted him because he cared about the same things I cared about. After Mrs. Rodriguez finished, Stevens called 2 more victims, Mr. Patterson, whose testimony about rationing his heart medication left the courtroom completely silent, and Mrs. Chen from Portland, who explained how Jake had convinced her that investing her late husband's pension would help other families avoid the financial struggles they'd faced. By the time the prosecution rested, Jake looked physically ill. He kept glancing back at me with an expression that seemed to be asking for something, forgiveness, understanding, or maybe just confirmation that I still saw him as human after hearing the full scope of what he'd done. Judge Hendricks called a 15-minute recess before the defense presentation, and I watched Marcus gather his papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone who just delivered a perfect closing argument. When he finally noticed me in the gallery, he walked over with that careful lawyer expression that revealed nothing. Emma. I didn't know you were coming. Jake asked me to be here, I said, and watched something tighten around his eyes. To support him? After what you just heard? To remember who he used to be. I studied my older brother's face, looking for any trace of uncertainty about what he'd just done. Marcus, that testimony about Grandma's will, was that even true? He was quiet for a long moment. Jake had the paperwork drawn up. If Dad hadn't intercepted it. But she never actually signed anything transferring the house, did she? I pressed. You made it sound like he nearly succeeded in stealing her home, but really he just had some lawyer draw up documents that were never executed. The intent was the same. The intent isn't the crime, Marcus. You know that better than anyone. I felt something hard forming in my chest. How much of your testimony was actual documented fact, and how much was your interpretation of Jake's potential actions? Marcus's jaw tightened. Everything I said was truthful. Truthful enough to send him to federal prison for 9 years. Truthful enough to protect future victims from a career criminal. The clinical language felt like a slap. Career criminal? Marcus, he's our baby brother. The one who used to practice magic tricks for hours just to make us smile at dinner. The one who's been systematically destroying our family for over a decade. Marcus's voice turned cold. Emma, you can't therapize away what Jake has become. Some people are just broken. Before I could respond, the bailiff called us back into session. As I returned to my seat, I realized that Marcus wasn't just trying to send Jake to prison, he was trying to convince himself that the brother we'd loved had never really existed at all. The defense was about to present their case, and I had no idea which version of Jake's story would emerge, the calculating predator Marcus had painted, or the deeply damaged man I still believed could be saved. Janet Walsh's defense strategy became clear within the first 5 minutes. She wasn't going to argue that Jake was innocent, or even that his crimes weren't serious. Instead, she was going to systematically dismantle the image Marcus had constructed of Jake as an irredeemable sociopath. Your Honor, my client's crimes are inexcusable, Walsh began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent 20 years defending people society had given up on. But Mr. Stevens and the government witness would have you believe that Jacob Morrison emerged from the womb with a briefcase full of forged documents and a list of elderly victims. The truth is far more complex. She called her first witness, Dr. Sarah Kim, a forensic psychologist who'd evaluated Jake during his 3 months in custody. Dr. Kim, what was your clinical assessment of the defendant? Mr. Morrison presents with severe anxiety disorder, depression with episodes of hypomania, and what I would characterize as complicated grief syndrome related to his father's emotional withdrawal during adolescence. Dr. Kim spoke with academic precision, but her voice carried genuine concern. He also shows classic symptoms of rejection sensitivity dysphoria, a condition where perceived criticism or abandonment triggers disproportionate emotional responses. I glanced at Marcus, watching for any reaction to hearing Jake's behavior pathologized rather than criminalized. His expression remained perfectly neutral, but I caught him gripping his pen hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. In your professional opinion, do these conditions excuse the defendant's criminal behavior? Absolutely not, Dr. Kim replied firmly. But they do help explain the psychological drivers behind his pattern of manipulation and fraud. Mr. Morrison's crimes appear to stem from a desperate need for approval and validation, combined with an inability to cope with the shame of disappointing people he loves. Walsh nodded. Can you elaborate on that dynamic? Mr. Morrison described a cycle where he would make increasingly grandiose promises to family members about his success, then commit fraud to maintain those illusions when reality fell short. Dr. Kim consulted her notes. He specifically mentioned feeling addicted to the approval he received from elderly investors who believed in his business acumen, something he'd never experienced from his own family. The psychological framework Dr. Kim was constructing painted Jake as pathetic rather than predatory, someone whose crimes grew out of emotional desperation rather than calculated malice. It wasn't an excuse, but it suggested the possibility of treatment rather than Marcus's preferred solution of permanent removal from society. Dr. Kim, do you believe the defendant can be rehabilitated? With intensive therapy, medication management, and a strong support system, yes. Mr. Morrison shows genuine remorse for his actions and demonstrates insight into the harm he's caused. She paused. However, rehabilitation would require acknowledgement from his family that his criminal behavior patterns developed within a dysfunctional family system that rewarded enabling over accountability. I saw Marcus stiffen at that last comment. Walsh had just implied that our family's dynamics had contributed to creating Jake's criminal behavior, a direct challenge to Marcus's narrative that Jake was simply born broken. Stevens stood for cross-examination, his voice sharp with prosecutorial skepticism. Dr. Kim, isn't it true that psychopaths often present as remorseful and insightful when it serves their purposes? That's correct, but Mr. Morrison's psychological profile doesn't suggest psychopathy. His emotional responses during evaluation were consistent with someone experiencing genuine shame and grief. Genuine enough to manipulate you into recommending leniency? Dr. Kim's expression hardened. Mr. Stevens, I've been conducting forensic psychological evaluations for 15 years. I'm quite capable of distinguishing between genuine remorse and performative manipulation. And yet the defendant managed to manipulate 17 elderly victims over 8 months by performing genuine concern for their welfare. Stevens shot back. Mr. Morrison's ability to connect emotionally with his victims actually supports my diagnosis, Dr. Kim replied calmly. Psychopaths manipulate through calculation. Mr. Morrison manipulated through projection. He genuinely craved the approval and validation he was seeking from these victims. So his need for emotional validation justifies stealing $180,000 from elderly people? Nothing justifies it. But understanding the psychological drivers is essential for determining appropriate intervention strategies. Dr. Kim looked directly at Judge Hendricks. Sending someone with Mr. Morrison's psychological profile to maximum security prison for 9 years without treatment is likely to exacerbate his underlying conditions and increase recidivism risk. I watched the exchange like a tennis match, each expert wielding their credentials to support opposing visions of Jake's fundamental nature. Dr. Kim was arguing for the possibility of redemption. Stevens was insisting on the necessity of punishment. But what struck me most was how absent Jake seemed from both narratives. The prosecution had turned him into a monster, the defense was turning him into a case study. Neither side was acknowledging the complicated, flawed, still lovable person I'd grown up with. Walsh's next witness changed everything. The defense calls Marcus Morrison. The courtroom went silent. I watched my older brother's face cycle through confusion, anger, and something that looked like panic as he realized he was being called to testify for the defense. Your Honor, the witness has already testified for the prosecution, Stevens objected. Ms. Walsh, what's your purpose in recalling this witness? Judge Hendricks asked. Your Honor, Mr. Morrison provided extensive testimony about his brother's criminal history, but he omitted crucial information about his own role in enabling that behavior. Information that's relevant to the court's understanding of the defendant's psychological development. Marcus stood slowly, his lawyer composure finally cracking. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked genuinely afraid. And I realized Janet Walsh wasn't just defending Jake, she was about to put our entire family's dysfunction on trial. Walsh approached the witness stand with the deliberate pace of a predator who'd found wounded prey. Marcus sat rigidly upright, his lawyer training warring with what I recognized as barely controlled panic. Mr. Morrison, you testified extensively about your brother's criminal behavior dating back over a decade, Walsh began. During that same period, how many times did you bail him out of legal consequences? Marcus's jaw tightened. That's not relevant to his current charges. Your Honor, it goes directly to the family dynamics that contributed to the defendant's behavioral patterns, Walsh said smoothly. I'll rephrase. Mr. Morrison, in 2018, when your brother forged checks from your parents' account totaling $3,400, what happened to those charges? They were dropped. Because you hired an attorney and negotiated restitution, correct? Yes. And in 2019, when he defaulted on the car loan your aunt co-signed, who made those payments to protect her credit? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I did. 12 monthly payments of $487 each, totaling $5,844. Is that correct? Yes. I watched Walsh systematically document 15 years of Marcus's interventions, every check he'd written, every lawyer he'd hired, every consequence he'd prevented Jake from facing. But more than that, she was exposing the twisted dynamic that had defined our family, Marcus playing God while Jake played victim, both of them locked in a dance that prevented any real accountability or healing. Mr. Morrison, when your brother stole jewelry from your grandmother in 2020, did you report it to police? No. Instead, you valued the items and quietly replaced them, spending approximately $8,200 of your own money. Is that correct? I was protecting my grandmother from additional trauma. Or protecting your brother from felony theft charges, Walsh countered. Mr. Morrison, in your professional opinion, what happens when someone repeatedly avoids consequences for their actions? Stevens jumped up. Objection, calls for speculation. Your Honor, the witness offered his professional opinion about criminal behavior patterns during direct examination. I'm entitled to explore the basis for that expertise, Walsh replied. I'll allow it, Judge Hendricks said. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Generally speaking, avoiding consequences can enable escalating behavior. So by consistently preventing your brother from facing legal accountability, you may have inadvertently contributed to the escalation that led to these federal charges? I watched something crack behind Marcus's eyes. The clinical detachment he'd maintained throughout his earlier testimony was crumbling, replaced by something raw and desperate. I was trying to help him, Marcus said quietly. By making his problems disappear? By giving him chances to get his life together. How many chances, Mr. Morrison? 10? 20? Walsh's voice turned sharper. At what point does helping become enabling? At what point does a protective older brother become complicit in creating the very monster he later claims must be permanently removed from society? Objection. Stevens shouted. Argumentative. But the damage was done. Walsh had exposed the fundamental contradiction in Marcus's position. He'd spent 15 years preventing Jake from facing consequences, then used Jake's escalating behavior as justification for destroying him completely. Mr. Morrison, you testified that your brother should receive a maximum sentence with no possibility of early release. Do you believe you bear any responsibility for the circumstances that led to these crimes? Marcus stared at his hands for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I should have stopped helping him years ago. And now that you have stopped, is the appropriate response rehabilitation or revenge? The question hung in the air like a blade. I watched my older brother, the one who'd carried the weight of our family's dysfunction for decades, finally confront the possibility that his love had been as destructive as Jake's lies. Marcus looked up, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom for the first time that day. I don't know anymore, he whispered. Judge Hendricks called for a 30-minute recess after Marcus's testimony, and I found him in the hallway outside the courtroom, slumped against a wall with his head in his hands. The competent prosecutor who'd entered this building 3 hours ago had been replaced by someone I barely recognized, broken, uncertain, human. Marcus, I said, approaching carefully. He looked up with red-rimmed eyes. She destroyed me in there. She made you tell the truth. The truth? Marcus laughed bitterly. The truth is that I created this monster, Emma. 15 years of writing checks and making phone calls and convincing myself I was protecting him, when really I was just protecting myself from having to admit my baby brother was broken. I sat down beside him on the cold marble floor. Jake made his own choices. Did he? Or did he make the choices I taught him to make? Marcus pressed his palms against his eyes. Every time he screwed up, I fixed it. Every time he faced consequences, I made them disappear. What kind of lesson does that teach someone? For the first time since this nightmare began, I heard genuine doubt in Marcus's voice. Not the clinical certainty he displayed in his testimony, but the confused pain of someone who'd finally realized his good intentions had paved a road to hell. So what happens now? I asked. Now I have to decide if I'm going to let the prosecution use my victim impact statement during sentencing, or if I'm going to stand up in there and tell Judge Hendricks that maybe my brother deserves a chance at rehabilitation instead of 9 years in federal prison. The weight of that choice settled between us. Marcus's statement could be the difference between Jake getting the maximum sentence or having a possibility of early release with treatment. After everything Jake had done, to Marcus, to our family, to those elderly victims, my older brother still held his little brother's future in his hands. What does your gut tell you? Marcus was quiet for a long time, watching lawyers and families stream past us in the hallway. My gut tells me that Jake called Mrs. Rodriguez every Friday for 2 months because he was desperate for someone to be proud of him. And that the reason he was desperate is because I spent 15 years teaching him that love was conditional on performance. When court reconvened, Judge Hendricks moved directly to sentencing. She'd heard enough testimony to understand the complexities of Jake's case, the genuine harm he'd caused, the psychological factors that contributed to his crimes, and the family dysfunction that had enabled his escalation. Mr. Morrison, she said, addressing Jake directly. You pleaded guilty to serious crimes that caused real harm to vulnerable people. Your victims trusted you with their life savings, and you betrayed that trust for personal gain. Jake stood with his shoulders squared, looking steadier than he had all day. Yes, Your Honor. I understand that. However, this court also recognizes that your case presents unusual mitigating circumstances. The psychological evaluation suggests genuine potential for rehabilitation, and the testimony reveals family dynamics that may have contributed to your behavioral patterns. I held my breath as Judge Hendricks consulted her notes. I'm sentencing you to 48 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release with mandatory psychological treatment and community service focused on elder care. You will also pay full restitution to your victims. 4 years instead of 9. Jake sagged with relief, and I watched Marcus close his eyes like he was finally allowing himself to feel something besides anger. But Judge Hendricks wasn't finished. Mr. Morrison, I want you to understand something. Your family's dysfunction doesn't excuse your choices, but it does help explain them. The question now is whether you'll use these next 4 years to break the cycle that created this situation. As Jake was led away, he turned back one final time to look at Marcus and me. For just a moment, I saw the little boy who used to build Lego cities with us, scared, hopeful, still believing that love might be possible even after everything he'd done. Marcus's kindness had finally run out 3 months ago when Jake destroyed his engagement. But sitting in that courthouse, watching my older brother choose mercy over vengeance, I realized something important. Kindness and enabling aren't the same thing. Love and consequences aren't opposites. Maybe, after 4 years and a lot of therapy, we could figure out how to be a family again. Not the broken, codependent family we'd been, but something healthier. Something real. It wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in months, it felt possible.